Now, This Week in Texoma.
Welcome to the program. We're talking politics today, and we'll start things off with Dr. Wendy Whitman Cobb. She is a professor of political science at Cameron University, and we'll want to get her opinions on the presidential campaign. Appreciate you taking the time to talk with us
My
today.
pleasure.
We've had Dr. Whitman Cobb on television on news reports a couple of times, but we thought this would be a chance to get more of a longer form conversation about what's going on, because people are really plugged into the presidential election this year. It reminds me a little bit of '08 when Obama was running for the first time. There seems to be a lot of energy on both sides of it. Is that, do you detect?
Absolutely. Yeah. The students at Cameron are really, really excited, and I think getting more so as the it moves on.
Right.
They are, I've got a lot of them going to the rallies, even if they don't support the candidates, just to feel what it's like to be part of the process.
I saw a statistic, I think from CNN the other day, that said every state on Super Tuesday saw an increase in Republican voter turnout.
But not Democratic.
Have you been a chance to kind of wrap your head around the reasons behind that?
I've been trying, and I think on the Republican side there is just a lot of more enthusiasm generated by the Donald Trump phenomenon rather than the Democratic side. We see the most enthusiasm on the ground level of the campaigns for Bernie Sanders, but the problem with that is that Bernie is predicating his support on younger college-age students, and unfortunately that's the demographic that just does not show up to vote.
Talk about the results in Oklahoma. Coming in, it was really something. It was a battleground state on both sides. We saw more candidates come through in this primary season than in recent memory. Let's look at the Democratic side first. Bernie Sanders came in, thought he had a chance to win.
And he did.
And he did.
He did.
That kind of caught me off guard.
It doesn't catch me off guard so much because, one, Oklahoma has a populist type of history. The roots of the state are in the populist movement. But also it's a demographically friendly state to him. He tends to win with older white men, or younger people and older white men. And unfortunately, for do you think it's for better or for worse here in Oklahoma, that's what our demographic makeup looks like.
Right.
And so it was very demographically friendly to the type of voters that Bernie Sanders is attracting.
And for his campaign, they regarded it as a nice victory just because it showed he could appeal outside of maybe what the vision is of where he is most appealing to, liberally leaning areas,
The problem for that, though, is that come November, Oklahoma is going to be a red state.
Sure.
And so it might show that he can be attractive outside of the northeast. But when we really look at it, what it means for November, it really doesn't mean all that much because most likely Oklahoma is going to vote Republican.
On the Republican side, Oklahomans voted for Ted Cruz, senator from neighboring Texas. Was there a bleed-over effect from that? Because I think a lot of people kind of thought it might have tilted toward Trump, given the fact that, he started campaighing here back in September, came to the state fair and this kind of thing.
No, I think the bleed-over from Texas is absolutely correct. This usually happens with neighboring states. We saw this with Bernie Sanders, with New Hampshire being a neighboring state to Vermont. So that's not surprising at all that Ted Cruz was able to capitalize on that sort of knowledge. We know more about him because he is a neighboring state senator.
Look at the Super Tuesday results as a whole on the Republican side, and let's just focus on that one. Donald Trump won the most states, which was kind of projected. Cruz won 3, I think. Rubio won 1. The delegates, though, are what matter, and I think that kind of gets lost, and it's probably the media's fault for not paying attention, because that still is a little bit of a race, especially with Cruz winning all the delegates in Texas.
Yes, and actually I think the media is actually doing a much better job this year than I've seen in years past of focusing on the delegate race. But even though Donald won a lot of states, he is only about 100 ahead in the delegate count. So it isn't mathematically guaranteed, I would say, that Donald is going to be the winner. But the momentum he's generating, the number of states he's winning, the number of groups he's appealing to, really does demonstrate the wide attractiveness that he is garnering with the populace.
When we talk about the primary season and all of those early states kind of scattering things out, we had talked before taping about how sometimes people are able to build momentum and we start to try to want to call the race before it's even started because it is a long season. Is that I mean, our system is what it is, but there seems to be a little bit of unfairness in all the attention that happens to the early winners.
Yeah, in political science and media studies, we call it horse race journalism, that we have a tendency to focus on the race, who's winning, who's losing, who's got the momentum, who's moving ahead. And because that's really what the viewers want to hear. It's the thrill of the victory, the agony of defeat.
Right.
And so that's what we really focus on. And, you know, I always ask my students whose fault is that, and ultimately it comes back to them because they're choosing to watch it.
Right.
So you're welcome. Media gets media gets a little bit left out here. But at the end of the day, it really that whole sort of mentality that who's winning, who's moving ahead, and the polls feed into this. And so it is unfair, particularly since a lot of the early states in the primaries are really, really unrepresentative of America as a whole. Iowa is not a representative.
Right. Almost purely white.
Yes.
And Hampshire, same thing.
Same thing. And so, you know, you do get kind of a skewed perspective, but those early states have become really important for building not only the momentum, but proving that you're a viable candidate.
Donald Trump's the front runner. Admit it, whenever he first decided that he was going to run for president, you went, well, we've heard this before, that's kind of funny, whatever, he's, you know.
I totally admit it. Last summer I said there's no way he's going to last, and now I'm eating my words. And it is so shocking that it has come to this. And it's really, I think, going to leave us scratching our heads for a few years going, how and why did this happen? And
it's not the first time that, you know, I started thinking about this the other night. People's heads are really exploding as to what's going on. But there is precedent for things like this in the past. Let's look back not too far ago. Let's look to California twice. First, they put Arnold Schwarzenegger in the most recent history, and then Ronald Reagan prior to that, and people who aren't of that era, that was the same kind of, wow, why are we putting an actor in charge of our state? So now to fast forward and go a reality TV star. And
it's a natural progression.
Isn't it, though? And it's also kind of frightening.
Yeah, I agree. It is somewhat frightening because you really do wonder, you know, do you know how to govern? Because running a campaign is one thing, and this is actually something that political scientists look at all the time, is that unfortunately a lot of presidents succumb to the idea that campaigning is governing or governing is campaigning, and they're two very different things. To be effective at campaigning is very different from having to work together. So, you know, you're going to have to work with Congress. And Donald Trump said, you know, Speaker Boehner, or not Speaker Boehner, but Speaker Ryan, if you don't work with me, you're going to pay a price. And that's not something you can really say to the Speaker of the House, who is third in line for the presidency.
But that talk is exactly what some people want to hear, I guess, at this point. And he is tapping into that populist vein that says, we don't like business as usual the way politics are working now. It's
the frustration and the anger that government supposedly isn't working. I would argue the opposite, that it is working. However, and I think you can only really appreciate that when you know about the political system. And I think that's the key to understanding this, is that unfortunately in America, there's a very low level of political knowledge. So even though Trump is winning with what he says, the highly educated and the lowly educated, when you think about the statistic that 10% of college graduates believe Judge Judy is on the Supreme Court,
oh my goodness.
It shows that there is a severe lack of political knowledge in this country, even among college graduates. So you combine that with the anger and the not understanding how Washington really works, and it's really easy for someone like Donald Trump to take advantage of those feelings of resentment and anger and frustration.
Talk about what happens with the Republican Party going forward. Let's project a couple of things here. Let's suggest that Marco Rubio wins Florida and gets a big stash of delegates all of a sudden. Let's pretend that John Kasich wins Ohio and gets a lot. Now all of a sudden it sort of turns back into a four-person race. I read something the other day where the math analysis is that Donald Trump needs to win like 52% of the remaining delegates to get enough to get the nomination.
So you're going to a brokered convention.
That's what I want to tell me. Yeah, tell me about that.
That is the fear, and especially with Mitt Romney giving the speech that he did this week about, you know, that he's saying Trump's a fraud and a phony, and really promoting this idea of voting for anybody but Trump. It really does stoke fears in the Republican Party that this could lead to a brokered convention, which would be probably disastrous for Republican Party unity for many years to come, because Trump will absolutely take advantage of that and say, look, they're trying to keep me out. The establishment is trying to keep me out. They're trying to keep me down, and so that's even more reason to vote for me. So a brokered convention would be a very dangerous thing. I still think the chances of it actually happening are rather remote. But if it, we'll have to see what happens on March 15th with the next big round with Ohio and Florida, and I think that will tell us a lot about what the road ahead looks like.
And take us to Political Science 101 on brokered convention, because this isn't something that's
No,
happened in recent history.
Not recently.
It used to happen with,
all the time.
with frequency. I remember famously David Brinkley, who was covering a convention one year, and he got frustrated and said, "There's no news happening here," and left. And that was what, mid 80s or so, whenever that happened. So tell people about how that brokered convention would work, and how before people would come in and trade delegates and determine at the convention who the nominee would be.
Well, and this really, the point at which we can look and see when it changes is 1968 with the Democratic National Convention, when everything breaks loose into chaos. And so after that, they really did try to change it. But before, brokered conventions were a normal thing. Party bosses would get together in the cliched, smoke-filled back rooms and negotiate and decide on who could be a candidate that would best represent all interests. And so it really was an elite-driven process. But following the chaos of 1968 Democratic National Convention, both parties started to institute more direct primaries and caucuses, where instead of party bosses deciding in back rooms, you would have delegates that would be pledged by vote. And that's the dangerous thing. Now, what happens in a brokered convention is on the first ballot, all of the delegates are pledged to vote for whoever their state voted for. But after that, all bets are off. And so that's when you're going to get into the trading and the horse trading, and you vote, can you pledge your delegates to me? And even then, you're going to get to a delegate by delegate sort of campaign, trying to bring them into your fold.
And when we're talking about the trading and the leveraging, would, for example, candidate A say, well, I'll withdraw for nomination, but what's in it for me? Does that person then say, okay, well, if you back out, I'll make you Secretary of Defense or something like that? Is that how that kind of works?
That's exactly how it happens. I mean, and you can think back, this has been happening in American history since, Andrew Jackson's thwarted campaign against John Quincy Adams in 1824, where John Quincy Adams won the vote in the House of Representatives solely by promising the Secretary of State position. So it's nothing new in American history. It happens it happens quite frequently. It just hasn't happened in our recent memory.
Well, I know people are really going to tune in, and that's one good thing. I mean, maybe that disconnect that you talked about before in terms of that political knowledge, maybe this will serve a greater purpose down the road.
I can only hope.
Educate the electorate and the public a little bit more. We do appreciate you taking the time to visit with Dr. Wendy Whitman Cobb of Cameron University, has been our guest. Continuing our political discussion today with Representative Scooter Park, Republican, representing District 65 out of Duval, and we want to talk about the budget crisis that they're dealing with at the state capitol. Representative Park, good to have you back.
Well, it's good to be back, David. Thank you very much.
Appreciate you taking the time. You guys knew this budget problem was going to happen well before the session even started. I mean, we're getting hints that the revenues weren't very good and that kind of thing, but man, it seems like each month that rolls along, it gets harder and harder and harder. We just got news on Thursday that there was even steeper cuts planned for this current fiscal year. Tell me what the mood is like up there at the Capitol. I've got to believe it's tough.
It is very tough, and the thing about it is, I mean, we did know that the budget cuts were going to be coming, and we did know that there was going to be the first revenue failure and then the second revenue failure to come. It showed, yet again, that how vitally important that it is that we must diversify our economy here in Oklahoma. And for number one. Number two, we have to be able to take the cap off the rainy day fund to be able to put more money back for years that like this happens, and to be able to take care of our state's needs without the cuts that we're facing, that we've already faced, and that we're still facing. And I really hope that we are and will be able to itemize the next cuts instead of across-the-board cuts.
It was just a couple of weeks ago that Representative Dennis Johnson from Duncan was here, and we had talked about that same possibility. But you guys would kind of have to go into a special session to deal with the budget. At the time, he said it didn't look like that was going to happen, but that there was still some talks about it. Is there any talk now to let you guys go back in as opposed to having that straight across the board sequester that you're talking about? Or
There is some talks about that. Now, the talks have really been, I think, held up and diminished from that I'm understanding from our House leadership.
Right.
That, from my understanding, the Senate side does not want to go along with those itemized cuts for whatever reason. I guess Senate has their reasons. I have not talked to any of the senators and see, what is going on their side. But we as a House have agreed unanimously that we do want to do the itemized cuts instead of across-the-board cuts, because we do not agree, period, yet again, on another cut to public education and some of the vital needs of government that we do not need to be cut.
There's a lot of things out there that you can look at in terms of tax credits, tax cuts. One of the things that we had talked about before taping was the income tax reduction that was triggered. Talk a little bit about that and if there's the possibility. I know that had been brought up, and it seems like everybody kind of has a cut that they want to pursue or a credit they want to pursue, but we're having a hard time finding some real agreement over what we can do. What's the feeling about that trying to remove that income tax cut that's going to come?
The income tax cut, now in my personal opinion, I think that we need to not have that cut right now because we have not seen the full effects yet of of the layoffs and what that's going to do to our economy, as far as the taxes, as far as the sales taxes and everything else that will be lost in lost revenue. And whether it's that $150 million that we will lose in the general fund by that tax cut or whatever, to me, as we had talked about, I've always believed that if you watch your pennies, your dollars will take care of themselves. And $150 million is still taking a bite out of a $1.3 billion deficit.
Right.
The second thing is on the exemptions and then the credits, every one of them are on the table, across the board. And to me, the credits, really have to be looked at, because if we're giving a credit out, the credit that's given, the revenue that company or whatever else that is receiving that credit has to supersede the credit that is given. And then the exemptions, they have to be looked at across the board. And even if we went back and took a piece of those exemptions, there are ways to be able to get back our economy and get back the revenues that we need to be able to get back to stabilize our state right now that we have to. And I think that's the right thing to do, and that's the business thing to do. We cannot keep going in the direction that we're going.
One of the taxes that was discussed, and it was brought up by Governor Mary Fallin in her State of the State address, was a potential increase on the cigarette tax. Ideally, it was going to fund teacher raises, also fund some health programs. That was placed in a committee, died out of committee for lack of support. What was your opinion on the proposal by the governor, and did you like that idea of the cigarette tax?
My deal was, and it came out even in the newspaper here in Lawton, in the newspapers that I'm in weekly. You cannot, if we was wanting to tie that to a teacher's pay raise or anything else, that is a contingency on a declining revenue. That is not a steady revenue source that we can rely on year to year that is steady. And as cigarette smoking declines, that revenue would decline. So we cannot put that on a contingency, whether it's for our teachers or to make it a constant revenue stream for our budget.
So at least that one is out of the way, but there's going to be other proposals that are going to come up. Last year was the first time you walked around the halls, and I'm guessing, takes a month or so just to kind of find out where everything is. Tell me how much more comfortable you were here in the first couple of 3 weeks as opposed to last year.
Well,
quite a difference?
It's been a huge difference. You know, last year we didn't have near as many controversial issues,
Sure.
for number one. Number two, when we got there to the Capitol last year, it was like you'd been shoved off in the deep end of a swimming pool, and you were trying to figure out, you know,
Right.
what was going on.
Right.
You know, on a lot of, you know, whether it was issues or how to, you know, negotiate
Yeah.
basically your way, you know, through the process.
Right.
And where, you know, you kind of figured that out for, you know, to a degree on some, but it has been really a very, very busy year at the Capitol this year. There's been a whole lot of people there at the Capitol this year. I mean, a whole lot more this year than what there was last year.
Right.
I guess even with all the controversial issues, whether it's, you know, your education, whether it was the budget and different agencies,
Yeah.
it is. Last year, it seemed like the session just slowly ramped up, where this year, on day one, it was like you were shot out of a shotgun.
The whole building was on fire from
Yes.
the time you walked in.
And it has been exhausting. That you look back in the last month has just flown by.
Right. Well, and we talked to Representative John Michael Montgomery earlier, and he's another one of those who came in as part of that freshman class a year ago with you and Representative Cootie or whatever, and he was kind of had the same similar response as you did, that he was amazed at how much more comfortable he was being able to come in this year, having last year, because he said, I knew who I could talk to. I was now seeking out people to help me with various things, as opposed to last year when every face looked kind of the same. And he said, and it was incredibly important that he got that out of the way, given all of the fires that you guys are having to put out. Let's talk about the budget real quickly. Another item that's out there, President David Bourne, the University of Oklahoma president, came to Lawton. He's touring all over the state, pitching a sales tax increase to help fund education. Says it would generate $600 million a year. If the petition drive happens, it'll go to the vote of the people, so it's nothing that you and the legislature are going to be dealing with. Still, you've got an opinion on how that works, and what is your sense of if that's a good thing or a bad thing for the state?
I totally disagree with that, just for the fact. I mean, number one, another penny increase in sales tax, that would put us as the top sales tax increase or sales tax in the nation. And to me, we want to be able to diversify. We want businesses to come to Oklahoma. If we're at the top in the nation, that is not going to get businesses into Oklahoma. That's going to keep more businesses out of Oklahoma. Number two, how many businesses would want to stay in Oklahoma on that account?
Right.
And then the third part about that is, of that, all the total sales tax that's in there, I think undoubtedly that we can be able to go back and get the teachers the pay raise that they deserve without any tax increase at all. And I know that we have been looking at that, and we will be able to get the teachers the pay raise that they do deserve. But as far as the part of that is going to go to higher education, to me, there are some colleges that cannot generate the amount of revenues that some of the big colleges can. And they need more of the help than what some of the big colleges. But to me, whenever some of the higher ed, and not all of them, whenever they are raising tuitions and making more revenue than they ever had in their school's history, but they're doing it on the backs of the young people that are trying to go to college to be able to get a higher education. And to me, that is very unfair to those young kids that are trying to get the higher education. It's a good concept. It's a good idea, especially for our teachers. But like I said, number one, I think we can do it without a pay raise or without a tax increase. And then it is not a good deal for the state.
We'll see what happens here with the petition drive. I mean, they still have a long way to go. I think they have to have 125,000 or so signatures. We only have about 30 seconds left. Tell me kind of what your mood is in terms of how quickly you guys are going to be able to get a handle on this. I know part of it's kind of constrained by when the numbers come in. When are you guys going to be able to come up with a budget plan? Is it going to be sooner than later? How's that going to work?
Now, I mean, I'm hoping that we will have a budget plan, before the very end of session.
Right.
And really and truly, I mean, I think that our budget chairman, that we have been working aggressively to try to be able to look at all the numbers, whether it's exemptions, whether it's credits, everything across the board, and to really get a good budget for Oklahoma and get it earlier than what we've done before, to get it on the table so we can all see it and be able to know what's going on and be able to bring it back and talk about it with our constituents before we have to vote on it.
It's an incredibly tough puzzle. You got a tough job, and we've got faith in you. You're going to be able to do the best thing for Southwest Oklahoma, but I certainly don't envy you being in that position at all. Appreciate you taking the time. Representative Scooter Park has been our guest, Republican of District 65. Thanks for joining us, folks. We'll see you next time.
If you have a topic or issue you'd like us to focus on, please write to the address on your screen or fax us at 357-3811. Or you can email us